newspapermen meet such interesting people. They know the lowdown, now it can be told. I'll tell you quite reliably off the record about some charming people I have known. For I meet politicians and grafters by the score, killers plain and fancy, it's really quite a bore. Oh, newspapermen meet such interesting people. They wallow in corruption, crime and gore. Ting-a-ling-ling, city desk, full the press, extra, extra, read all about it, it's a mess, meets the test. Oh, newspapermen meet such interesting people. It's wonderful to represent the press.
So the Media Project is underway. I am Rex Smith here with my colleagues, veterans of the journalism wars all, and we're going to give you a half-hour of commentary and hopefully some insight into some of the things going on in the media world these days. So here with me, Judy Patrick, Barbara Lombardo, and Miles Reed. Judith Patrick, being the former editor of the Daily Gazette, and Judith, I say, yes, now vice president of the New York Press Association.
Yes, I'm there, but I won't be there much longer.
Is that right?
I'm going to leave there, and I'm going to devote to directly helping local newspapers. I'm such a strong believer in local news that I think there has never been a more important time for me to supply the support I can give them. So we'll see what happens.
By encouraging your grandchildren to become readers? Is this the idea?
They are readers. What do you mean?
Okay. Barbara Lombardo is here doing her part by teaching UAlbany students now, former editor of the Saratogian and the Record.
Happy to be here, and am grooming
You are?
young journalists. I also
You're a
discovered
groomer?
yesterday.
That's what we hear about the left-wing press.
Yes. Not that I'm that well groomed, but there's a lot of journalism students who are planning to go into other than journalism. So I'm at least trying to create a generation of media savvy, good media literate.
That's a good thought. Actually,
citizens.
Let's come back to that in just a second after we say hello to the young man in the room, Miles Reed.
It's good to be here. Speaking of Barbara's teaching, we've had a good luck over the last couple of years, last 10 years, getting some great interns from UAlbany and a few staffers too. So that's a good pipeline, but she is correct. And we've observed that fewer and fewer of them want to go into journalism. Even if they studied it, it seems like, it's not as attractive these days.
Well, this is an interesting point. I just came from an event night before last at my alma mater, Columbia Journalism School, where they are making a key point of saying, why is it that we look at law school and say that's a training for all kinds of work? People go to law school and they become CEOs, they become university presidents or whatever. They don't all go into a courtroom. Journalism training is really extraordinary in the sense of teaching people to synthesize information, to be able to present it quickly. Right. What other skills do journalists have? So I think it is good training, actually.
I offered an online course we called it for citizen journalists, and I had very good response from people who wanted to become like correspondents to write the news for local newspapers. But what I found was most of them were just interested in learning how the news business works. So we went through ethics, we went through sourcing, we went through how a paper is put together and the business dynamics of it. And at the end of the day, I came away thinking, people just want to learn more about our business, our industry.
Are you ready, by the way, to talk about exactly how it is that you plan to be helping local media going forward?
No, I'm not.
Okay. We will have a time in this program and we will do that, right? Down the road. Excellent. Look forward to that. So let's talk a little bit about the news, because one of the factors that has led, we think, to a decline in the news business has been the loss of readership, the fact that people are simply turning away from the news. Now, there are many other factors. We can talk about that. But one of the interesting developments that new research is showing is that there is an uptick now, that suddenly more people in the United States are tuning in to news about national politics and now about the Trump administration than was the case, say, at the beginning of the Biden administration or even just a few months ago. What might be the cause of that?
I mean, I think it's got to be the presidential run. At least for us at the Gazette, our letters to the editor submissions are way up. Anytime we do a story now that has any kind of connection to something going on with the Trump administration or the controversy that's going on, we had a story yesterday about an old piece of graffiti in Schenectady that used to be called Susan is a Pinhead.
Ah, yes.
And it had been gone for a long time, but somebody this weekend went there to the same site and then wrote Elon is a pinhead. And so that story did very well for us online, got a lot of generated comments on both sides, saying, it's the liberal Gazette. You guys are just picking on him. And then the flip side, it was a very balanced story. We're not trying to pick on him, but it just generated a lot. So right now we're seeing a boost in terms of subscriptions. Our subscriptions are up. So hopefully it holds on at least for a while.
So it's the Trump bump. I mean, we had the Trump bump the first administration. Now we're seeing the Trump bump the second administration. I think Republicans are tuning in because they're, rah, rah, wow, look at what he's doing. And Democrats are looking in, again, clasping their pearls, saying, oh, my God, where are we headed? But, I mean, as much as there's some concern about what the president is doing in terms of our civil liberties and the freedom of the press and our economy, the impact on the media is undeniable.
That's true, too. And I think there's also a desire among people to figure out, what does this mean to me? What might it mean to me? And what can I do about it? And the only way to begin to answer those questions is to learn more about the story behind the story and the details.
It's a great opportunity for local journalism, I would think, to step in to answer exactly that question, Barbara. What does this mean to me? When we're looking at the huge impact of the Trump tariffs, if we can try to dissect that, if we can look at what kinds of consumption patterns there are in our communities, what products are likely to be most impacted. And I would think if you were the editor of the Adirondack Daily Enterprise, for example, you'd be wanting to really dig into tourism, to which resorts are most dependent upon Canadian tourists for their revenue, because we have a sense that that's actually falling off dramatically. So that's a great opportunity. And some outlets have really, of course, distinguished themselves. The Atlantic, of course, got a huge circulation bump when they broke the Signalgate story. Wired is another national publication that's got a lot of this Washington stuff going on. But for those of us in the local media, it's actually harder because you're not just going with the latest stuff out of Washington. You're trying to look at what the impact is on your readers specifically.
Yeah, that's where the real news is happening. And I think it's a challenge because we've talked before on this program about how covering the ICE raids is difficult because the ICE isn't typically forthcoming about what they're doing and where and when. And the companies that are employing people who may not have their proper documentation are reluctant to talk to the press. These are complicated stories. Businesses who may be affected by the tariffs, business people don't typically love talking to the press, I found. But this is where I think local news needs to step up. I almost, at one point in the last week or so, grabbed an old notebook and headed out to cover a story because nobody was covering it, and I thought it was important. It wasn't something you could do from the safety of your living room or your office. You need to get in your car and go out and actually talk to people. Local organizations have fewer and fewer people to do that nowadays, and I need to recognize that. So I need to get my notebook. Perhaps that's what I'll do.
Maybe that's it.
Citizen journalists, reliable citizen journalists.
Judy, can you come to the Gazette this afternoon and help us out?
Wait a minute. Oh, wait, I guess it's okay. I don't have an allegiance anymore. Actually, one of the interesting issues is because there is so much news, you wonder about the obscuring of other big news. I heard you folks who do the Roundtable, the morning program at WAMC, discussing the point that big news in New York State, chaos in the state prisons, has been somewhat obscured, of course, because we're watching what's coming on in Washington. The prisons are releasing some prisoners who are within, I think it's 111 days of their release date. They're speeding up release to ease overcrowding because they've lost a couple thousand prison guards over the Wildcat strike. This is all stuff that ordinarily you would think, wow, screaming headlines, early release from prisons, corrections officers, the corrections officers union in chaos, or is the prison system itself in chaos? But it is hard, even if you report that thoroughly, to get an edge on that, to get that awareness into your readers, listeners, viewers' minds, because there's so much else going on.
And also because stories like that take a lot of time to research and to report, and then the media, we tend to report it as a one-shot deal, and to really keep it on top of mind of people, you have to stay on the story and find offshoots of it and continuing developments, and that's how I think it gets legs, and it's a very difficult thing to do.
It is a hard commitment in that we've had probably about half the days since the prison strike started up to now. We've probably had front page stories done by a recent UAlbany grad, Sean Ness, who's one of our best young reporters down in the Hudson Valley. But on a lot of those days, it was the only story he did that day because it took so much of a time commitment to go to the the demonstrations, etc. And most of the time we have our reporters do 2 stories. So it was a calculated thing where we said it was big enough to keep doing it, but we didn't do it every day. So
one of my former students, go Sean.
Yeah.
This may be an unpopular opinion, but as people who've been in the business a long time, at least there are no longer any slow news days where you don't know what to lead the paper with.
Yeah.
I mean, I can remember those days. Those days are gone.
There have been days, I recall, there were days when I would think, let's just not do a front page today because there's nothing good to go to the front page. That is not the case. I can't imagine that happened.
I can't remember the last time we didn't have overflowing with local things, too. It's exciting, but it's a lot.
We did. When Judy's right about the Trump bump, when we changed administrations from Trump to Biden, news slowed down.
Yeah.
Definitely. And that in reality, most days are slow news days, but they haven't been during the Trump administration.
Yeah, there's always stuff that you can pick up to look at the local impact. I'm interested in the notion of 1 story a day being problematic. That is an interesting development.
Yeah, if we have 5 daily papers, and these days some of the papers that we have really only have 1 dedicated reporter. So it's the obligation we have, especially to make sure people want to keep buying some of those papers, to actually have them do 2 stories. And I think for a long time that has been our standard. Doesn't mean that it always happens, especially if somebody's working on a more in-depth weekend story.
I'm sorry if this is a naive question that I should know the answer to. Do you roll that all up into a single website?
We do. And there's different sections of the site, but it's all one main website. And then across the top, people can click into it. But it's essentially like different sections on that website.
I think that's a really thoughtful, sensible approach for a local media enterprise now, to give it a regional impact with some local flavor to it, right?
I mean, we operate everything out of one content management system, so it makes it much easier, especially because, our folks are sort of spread out all over the Hudson Valley and the Mohawk Valley, but everything goes in through this same system, so we can allocate a story to any of the different papers we want, but we try not to spread them on everything.
And how do you deal with being the one editor with such a broad geographic reach then? It's not what you initially signed up for.
Sure, it's not at all. It's the hardest question is to have a story that we think has regional impact for all the different papers. The prison strike one was an example that really worked because we have prison up in Fulton County, we have them in Columbia County, Greene County, and we used to have one in Saratoga County. We don't have one anymore, but so it's a little bit trickier, but we try to say if it's an impact of Doge or whatever, we try to talk to voices in the Hudson Valley, the Mohawk Valley, and Schenectady Capital Region and try to make it across all the boards.
That's a really great thought. And I think that's a great role for an editor, is to remind reporters to broaden their story, to base it on what they're reporting locally, but broaden it enough to reach people outside that locality. A really great idea that could be passed along as an editor training school,
There's also been, this is nothing new, that smaller newspapers would depend on the Associated Press to provide statewide, for instance, or national or statewide news. And in an ideal world, you would be able to use your knowledge with your local reporting and editing staff to enhance a wire story from the AP, but you see less and less of that. And an example came to mind the other day or last week when the AP provided a story about Stefanik being pulled off of the nomination for the UN ambassador and told to go back home where you can hold on to your seat. And it was the local media that reported beyond the AP story to explain about Constantino,
Yep.
Who's threatening a 3-way race if he doesn't get an endorsement.
Did it not seem to you, by the way, as that might have been the straw on the camel's back that pushed them to decide that she had to stay in the house?
It might have been, but it wasn't reported that way at all by the AP.
I think that would be a great bit to report, to see if there was any polling being done, to see what impact a third candidate might have had in that race, and whether that might have been, because it was right after his announcement that he would be a third-party candidate, that the White House decided to keep Elise Stefanik in the House. So just fuel for future reporting in this community. Your thoughts, people, are always welcome. media@wamc.org. This is the Media Project. We didn't identify Miles at the top as being the editor of the Daily Gazette, but you probably figured that out. And next to me is his predecessor, Judy Patrick. Barbara Lombardo is here. We're going to go back to some more talk about what's going on in Washington, about one of the interesting things that you often see is the dynamic in covering the White House, covering any center of authority, covering the New York State Capitol, covering City Hall. There is a lot that goes into making the reporting possible that readers often, listeners, viewers, don't know about or care about. And here's a tiny detail, and that is where people sit in the White House press briefing room. The Trump administration is going to take over assigned seats after they have already taken over who gets to be the pool reporter when they're in a tight quarter. And what it's going to mean is that the seating chart that has been under the White House Correspondents Association is going to be taken over by the White House itself, which will surely elevate some of the right-wing, non-fact-based journalism organizations. Is there a less judgmental way to say that? Anyway, that it will surely elevate them into positions of prominence where they will probably have more of an edge in reporting. Sort of just the latest salvo in the White House press corps battle. And what is the impact of this on the audience? What's likely to happen because of that?
You know, what I was initially more concerned about was the White House controlling who actually had access to the room. I thought that was very important. Whether or not celebrity reporters get to sit in the front row or not is less of a concern to me. It was struck, though, because this came down about the same time that the White House Press Correspondents Association decided to disinvite a comedian to their annual dinner. I have said this before. I think this dinner is a stupid idea. I do not like it. It's not so much about the free press. It's more about a celebrity event. But I thought it was interesting that they disinvite the comedian and then the White House decides, well, we're going to tell everybody where they can sit anyway. So it did nothing for them to capitulate to their demands that the comedian not come to their dinner. So again, the dinner, I've never liked the dinner. I wish they would give it up, go have a beer someplace.
You do make a good point about that, because the notion of sitting there trying to yuck it up with the White House press secretary when she might be very well the target of the comedian and the other speakers is disingenuous at best. Awkward. And over the years, I participated in 16 years of the Legislative Correspondents Association events here. Those were fun, but it seems like that era is really over.
You had a great singing voice for that.
Well, thank you. You don't really need a good singing voice to be the Legislative Correspondent show.
Actually, that's true, too. As far as the seating at the White House, I agree with Judy that the real concern is who gets to get into that room in the first place. And the seating, to me, is less important, and I don't think we could ever get the public to give a hoot about whining about where you get to sit. The idea is if you're in the front, you're going to get called on. But if you're not the right media that Carolyn Levitt wants to call on, you could be sitting anywhere and you're not going to get called on. You could be in the front row waving, and you're not going to get called on. So you could be in the back and you could get called on. So it's hard to, I think, get my dander up about that one, but it reminded me about City Hall in Saratoga Springs, and when I was the city reporter, and they had, because these kinds of things can trickle down, and how it's adapted at local places. A lot of them don't even have a reporter anymore, but they had set up the reporters, and there were several from the area media who would go to all of these meetings that I would be at for the Saratogian, and we would sit in the in the peanut gallery, the stands with everybody else. Then they set up a table in the front of the room to the side so that the media would stay there, supposedly so you could hear better and whatever. But I never sat there because you're trapped there. And as a good reporter, and I would try to teach my reporters that when I became their editor, that you want to be able to see, walk into the room, get the feel for it, sit somewhere where you could grab people for comments. You can follow somebody out of the room if you needed to get some quotes or more information about them. So they were worried about efforts to organize and stilt where people can sit if they're trying to cover an event. It could go beyond the White House.
Yeah, and I think we have a case right here in our area that we've covered about, I think, efforts to restrict our access. In Amsterdam, they implemented a policy about 6 months ago that very much limits how much the public can actually move around City Hall and included in offices, and very much have pushed us off. So, it's a democratically controlled City Hall. And so I just worry that governments are using these kind of advanced tactics. And I think what the White House is doing is totally inappropriate. But I think more and more of them are doing these steps to try to limit how much we can do. And I think we need to keep pushing back. And we wrote an editorial questioning some of these efforts. They said it was because there were some threats against some of the City Hall employees. Again, they haven't barred us totally, but it makes it harder to do the job, and so then the public misses out.
That's terrible.
It certainly happens in the New York State government. Nowadays, covering the New York State legislature is harder because you can't buttonhole members. There's an area behind the speaker's rostrum in the New York State Assembly that used to be a place where you could find legislators to talk to them. You used to have free access to the floor to go get an assembly member, or almost similar access in the state Senate. That is now restricted. You can't go onto the second floor where the governor's offices, the executive offices are. That is now restricted. So these efforts have paid off. Same thing is going on at the Pentagon. The administration has removed outlets longstanding that used to cover the Pentagon that have full-time reporters there, and instead they've pushed out those organizations because the administration doesn't like their reporting. Now making room for outlets that don't regularly cover the Pentagon, but now they've got the desk of the reporters who used to have their space. It's basically saying that Donald Trump's sending a message that who's really in charge here, he gets to determine as much as possible how his presidency is covered. And it does remind reporters that you have to fight for every inch you're going to get.
And so far, things are going fairly well, but you never know what stories aren't being covered. And that's the thing that you run into when you can wander around a city hall and just poke your head into an office of the controller, for example, and say, hey, what's new? And then you'll find out what's new. Those stories aren't going to happen if you can't do the wandering around the Capitol, the Pentagon. Not that I think we should be wandering around the Pentagon.
It's an amazing notion. When I covered the courts on Long Island for Newsday, I would go in first thing in the morning, and the Felony Screening Bureau would set me up at a desk and hand me the files of the guys who were about to be arraigned. And I'd look through these files, all this stuff that I'm sure they didn't want to have released, but I needed to have the background on the cases. So that was a wonderful luxury for me as a reporter. And of course, that doesn't happen anymore.
I had a similar experience when I worked for Barbara first, and I often covered crime in courts. And I used to go to the county clerk's office, and before they actually took all the fresh lawsuits and filed them, there would be a big stack, and I would just leaf through them and find what I was interested in, write down the notes. And they've changed that policy, and now it's like getting into Fort Knox trying to get that stuff.
Your thoughts, folks, media@wamc.org. We'd be happy to hear from you. I was interested in a piece that we read on Poynter.org, a website from the journalism think tank in St. Petersburg, Florida, Poynter, talking about what people, ordinary citizens, can do if you're concerned about press freedom. And this was just an interesting assessment with 3 different suggestions, which I think we could probably all agree to. Number 1 is subscribe to stay informed.
Amen.
How do you transfer people from just casual readers into subscribers? What's the technique, by the way, that's being used these days, Miles?
I'd love to know. Please tell me. No, it is a big part of what we try to do in terms of really focusing on that. And occasionally I'll hold town halls where I invite readers, ideally subscribers, to come and ask questions, criticize us, whatever they want to do. But it's an uphill battle. My positive outlook of this is that it feels like in the marketplace of ideas that is social media now, that we actually have defenders who support us. So the story I talked about Elon is a pinhead. Some of the right-wing readers got on Facebook and criticized us for doing it. And then I noticed a big sort of pushback from that, other readers saying, did you read the story? It seems like a balanced, fair story. So hopefully, if we can get people to be engaged and start to realize that if they want to be invested in their community, they have to trust local news sources because there are fewer than there used to be.
I think we also need to be more cognizant of our role and make our sites and our papers more reader-friendly. We need to take a harder look at what we're doing, what we're offering our readers every day online. Are they enjoying what are their problems? Are we making it easy for them to sign on and stay signed on? Are we interrupting the flow of their story with flashing video ads? I mean, I think all of those have a part. And
Super annoying.
I think we need to take a hard look at that and do what we can to balance the needs of us, of our our companies from a revenue perspective, but also not turn away the readers. We want to give them a pleasant experience, and one that they will come away and think it's valuable for them to pay for.
UX, as they call it, the user experience, has to be strong. So number one, pay for the news. Number two, subscribe to stay informed. That is, those organizations that are working on freedom of the press. The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, RCFP, the Freedom of the Press Foundation. There are some of these organizations that are actually working hard, and I think that if you pay attention to that so that you know what's going on, that's this formula, the Freedom of the Press Foundation, that can help people to stay informed of what's at risk. Keep on top of the loss of Voice of America. Be aware of those losses to press freedom around the world. And number three is keep an ear to the ground. People concerned about press freedom can observe their own town or city for threats to journalism in real time. What you were describing, Barbara, of not having access to some of the areas of City Hall, that kind of thing. People should be aware of what's going on in their communities. By the way, just one final point before we go out of here. The latest good news about how the public feels about this. When you ask them, should the federal government continue to fund NPR and PBS or remove funding, 43% of adults say yes, continue to fund. 24% say no, don't. So by an almost 2-to-1 margin of those who have an opinion, Americans favor continued funding for public broadcasting, which means maybe we can keep this show going.
Oh, a little Mary Sunshine under the show. With an optimistic note.
Oh, yes, it's all fine. We have to go. We're out of time. We forgot to turn on our counter when we began the program, so we have no idea when the show's actually over. Miles Reed and Judy Patrick and Barbara Lombardo, and I'm Rex Smith. We are grateful to our producer, Dave Gustina, for helping put this all together. Mostly, though, to you folks for joining us. Thanks. We'll see you again next week on The Media Project.
Paper Guild, got a free new world to build. Meet the people, that's a thrill. All together fits the bill. Oh, newspapermen are such interesting people. It's wonderful to...
The Media Project is a national production of WAMC, Northeast Public Radio. This week's projectors include former Times Union editor and current Upstate American Substack columnist Rex Smith, Judy Patrick, Vice President for Editorial Development for the New York Press Association and former editor of the Daily Gazette, Barbara Lombardo, Adjunct Professor at the University at Albany and former editor of the Saratogian, and editor and Vice President of the Daily Gazette, Miles Reed. You can listen to The Media Project anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or anywhere you get your podcasts. I'm your producer, David Gustina. Thanks for listening.
Get those readers, get that payoff. What a headache, what a mess. Oh, publishers are such interesting people. Let's give 3 cheers for freedom of the press.